me. You guys haven't told me how big it is. All right.
You don't have to use that mic the whole time. Okay.
I'm not going to, but it's kind of fun. Makes me feel powerful.
It is nice.
Yeah, right? Okay, I'm going to say okay over here. All right. How is everyone? Yeah, no, you guys have to be loud in here. All right. Okay. So we are doing some more What is Religion? And I may fall over at some point. I may have chosen the wrong shoes. So let's see. Hi, Kathy Lynn. Yay. So we there are people here. Come on, everyone wave, everyone wave. Say yay. Hey. Yeah, so just in case you can't see them from the I do believe this might be sliding down. Anyway, just let me know if it gets too low and you're like staring at my midsection or something and you're like, wow, that's so weird. All right, so so we're looking at the idea of what is religion, and I've already gotten to the scoop that we're never actually going to come up with a definition for religion, because essentially we can't define what religion is, because in doing so, the first day, what did we learn? I'm taking a knee. What did we learn? Yeah. Yes, exactly. So what happens is when we come in to try to define what religion is, we tend to use our own experiences and our own traditions to define it. So essentially what happens is, I'm going to use this microphone. Usually I use my magic wands, but we use this, my tradition that I have esteemed as religion, becomes the plumb line by which I'm going to now judge the Weissman's religion and Annette's religion, okay? So if we do that, we will tend to find faults in other traditions. So defining religion actually becomes very, very difficult, because it's really hard to wrap your head around all the potential concepts that could be incorporated in the idea of what religion is, okay? And on that first day, we spent a lot of time talking about all those things, all right? Last week, we talked about pre-understanding. Can anyone give me a definition of pre-understanding? It's like in the name. Exactly, what you knew before you knew something. Exactly. Okay, and we mentioned some pre-understandings we may have had as kids, like Santa Claus. Anyone here still believing in Santa Claus?
Probably just me.
I look straight to John Mark. Okay, most adults, when they learn that Santa isn't real, do what? Or most kids, when they finally wrap their head around that Santa's not real and they've done all their litmus tests, that's me, all right? You don't go on believing when you have figured out that something isn't it, right? So the neat thing about understanding that we have pre-understanding is that pre-understanding needs to consistently be adjusted according to new knowledge. Did you guys know that knowledge is powerful? Yeah, I want to make sure all these people are nodding. Yes, knowledge is powerful. So when my brother, this is the story I told about my Santa Claus experience, when my brother opened up the laundry room door, beckoned me to him, and being the obedient little sister that I am, I came running. Yes, Greg. And he said, "Behold, all of your Christmas presents. There is no Santa." And my little 8-year-old world was devastated. But then I kind of moved on and realized I was still getting the same presents. Anyway, I was a little materialist as a kid. But when I didn't press through and say, no, you're lying. Like, I learned that there was something that came in. So knowledge is power. I was able to actually move into a spot of freedom where I was now able to enjoy another version of what Christmas would be, not necessarily contingent on this fake individual flying some reindeer. Now, I need to say this very clearly because I want everyone to understand, because people sitting here now and then sitting on Sunday might feel a very confused message. I am super pro myth and story, okay? And I do think that we have lost, that Americans, that the West has lost a lot of story because we're so dependent on science and reason and the intellect, okay? So I do think that there's a super strong need for story. So I'm not dissing or throwing shade on story as much as I am on thinking that this story necessarily controls everything. Okay, does that make sense? Right? Okay, so let me say it this way. When we look at the history of the cultivation of religion and traditions, and again, I'm going to try really hard to avoid the evolutionary theory of religions, but looking more at the idea of pre-modern human tended to make divinities out of storms, right? Yeah, pre-modern. Oh, before, yeah, like the era, like I would say, because most people like to use the Reformation as the start of modernity, but it's not. Luther's not modern. He's still very much medieval. So here's a good example. So Luther is going to law school and a big, huge storm comes and threatens him and he's terrified. He's raised in a household that actually has a strong sense of the fear of hell. He's Catholic, strong sense of the fear of hell. This storm comes and it's God's judgment on Luther, okay? And so Luther prays and begs God, I will become a monk if you save me out of this storm, okay? In that moment, Luther exposes his medieval attitude towards nature in that this storm was a divinized concept that was coming for him to teach him something. Okay, so he bargains with God and he makes a deal. All right, that's sort of like a pre-modern thought in that when we don't have certain tools intellectually to comprehend our external environment as storms happen because there's a cold front and a warm front and it's not really personal, it's not coming from Brian, right? But you may be caught in it, but it's really an external thing. We tend to want to reason because we're very rational creatures. We make sense of our world through whatever pre-understandings we have. And unless you've taken a great big rocket trip outside of the sphere of the globe or even a trip beyond Germany, you don't necessarily know what else is out there, right? It's why historically, long time ago, this is most evident in Texas. When you look at the Texas horizon, it is a straight line. It looks like the world could be a cube, right? But we have images now that demonstrate that the world is round, unless NASA and the government are caballing to really mess with us, which is a lot of money and a lot of time. But we have a certain, when we receive new information, it changes our pre-understanding, okay? Not many of us hold, well, I'm gonna take that back. I was just about to say, not many of us hold to the idea that the Earth that we live on is a cube, though we do have a resurgence of flat Earth theory, okay? That the images that we see are false. So anyway, so we have this pre-modern person had an ability to reason and ration that incorporated divinity into sort of the natural elements around, okay? When we get into modernity, you see a shift. And I think Rene Descartes is probably one of the best instances of the shift to modernity, which is 1600s, a philosopher, French philosopher, if you couldn't tell by the Rene and the Descartes. But he's the guy, if you ever heard the phrase, I think, therefore I am, that's your guy. That's where modernity kind of starts, because it starts to locate humanity as the thing in the center. All right, and that's when we start to get more modern engagement. That's where you have the scientific revolution sort of start to burgeon out into the world. And now we're in post-modernity, where everything, and we're going to get into this today, where everything can get trapped in my personal mind, okay? So I can, whatever I want God to be, that's what God is. Whatever I want religion to be, that's what religion is. Whatever I want spirituality to be, it's whatever's true for Susan is true for Susan and not true for me, okay? Post-modernity, when we look at it, philosophically, its worst component, that if it were to become what it strives to be, it could be autonomous balloons floating off into the atmosphere. Now, I have a high view of postmodernity and think that the challenge against tradition and modernity is good. But in general, if we really do isolate all of religion or God or spirituality or theology or philosophy, to me, in my head, how then do I foster community with other people? It tends to be almost like, do I want to say quantum particles that sort of like move and then shift and then move and then shift? Like, we want to have some sort of communion with others. Not that everyone has to think the same, but that we don't want to be isolated in the truth of our mind. Does that make sense? Okay. Distinguishing between those eras is really difficult, and that wasn't on my teaching outline for tonight, so. Anyway, what I like to do when I talk about pre-understanding to really drive it home is, this worked with my students really well. I am holding, if you guys can see this on the Zoom, I am holding a Greek New Testament. Who here knows Koine Greek? Oh, I do. All right, I am reading from the book of Acts, chapter 9, starting at the first verse. And Saul, upon learning the truth about Jesus' favorite color, he told his disciples that it was green. Who wants to challenge me on it? You guys want to challenge me on it?
I mean, I'm not going to say that I'll challenge you, but I highly doubt that that's what that says.
Right, but can you read Greek?
No.
But I can read Greek, right? So one of the things about this idea of pre-understanding is that if we are not aware of pre-understanding, we can hold other people captive to our authority and power. Okay, so what we want to do is in using this, so when you are starting your first, when you're taking your first evil genius, evil dictator class 101, okay, you would learn a few things about how to control people. One of them is to maintain the source of power. Make sure you're the authority on everything, okay? Don't let anyone learn anything else, all right? So this is what when you actually like start digging into the history around what's going on with the Nationalist Socialist Party in Germany in the 20s and mostly the 30s and 40s, and Hitler, is this control of what people hear, what people see, what people learn, okay? And the reason why knowledge is so important is because it provides a way for people to learn, so to challenge potentially violent and abusive authority, okay? There was a time in church history where everything was in Latin, okay? Who here knows Latin? I'll raise my hand again. I have recently learned it. But anyway, the service, everything was in Latin. The readings, the text, all of it in Latin, okay? How many peasants in, let's say, Germany, I'm gonna use going back to the 1500s, how many peasants in Germany probably knew Latin? Probably none, probably none. They would go to church, they would sit, and they would watch, and there would be a bell. We have bell here sometimes. There'd be a bell to indicate something's happening at the Eucharist, and then there would be a few more bells, and then whew. I was like, oh my gosh. Whew. All right. All right, so there would be signifiers. You know, the priest would do the same thing every week, but the whole entire service, everything would be in Latin. The peasants never knew what was going on. Did they have any power in that situation? They were told what to think, what to do, what to believe, okay? When Luther came along, I brought part of my library to do a little show and tell. Okay, I know Luther had some major issues. Primarily, he was a very big anti-Semite. And for that, I always have to wrestle with that aspect of his theology. But one thing he did was this. This is the German Bible. Okay, he translated it out of the Greek and the Hebrew. All right. There were, at the time in the 1500s, there were 3 different languages for Germans. There was kind of like this High German, Mid German, Low German. Luther, when he went to translate this, chose Low German to put the text of the Bible in so that the common person could pick it up and read and understand and know on their own that God loves them. Okay, and not be beholden. What do you think? Do you think that the church was really stoked when Luther was like, oh, I've got this thing now in German? No. He had to flee for his life often. Okay? But when this Bible came out, written in the low vernacular, it actually revolutionized all German language so that it became more unified. But also, the people could understand, finally, what was going on in the text and what was going on at the table and what was going on in just the basic generalities of all things related to their religion. Okay, so all of that to say is that if you want to be a really good evil dictator, what you do is you control the source of power and knowledge. All right, you also want to get rid of the arts. That's a no-no. You don't want artists changing people's minds. All right, so pre-understanding is something that we all have, and it can be manipulated. So when you empower people, they become equals in knowledge. And then you have a dialogue partner, and in this dialogue, so I'm an authority here, I'm a priest, and I've got people in front of me, even on Zoom, who are hopefully becoming more and more educated, right? And so that one day, Susan says, hey, you said something in your sermon, and I remember something that you kind of taught before, and it contradicted, and that keeps me in check. Okay, when the people can call out the leaders and the authorities because their pre-understanding is constantly changing and growing and evolving, then you have a real community. Okay, and so that's what's really important about understanding that we have pre-understanding, because if we get stuck in our pre-understanding, you will be 46 and believing in Santa, right? Like, you have to keep moving. This is why we always want to be forever learners. It's why I love Confucius, because he argues that you never transform just to finally get to some place. You're always in the process of transforming. The sage is always becoming a sage, all right? And so becoming a lifelong learner and resisting the tendency to want to sort of calcify helps with kind of creating that robust community where the authority has to watch what they're doing, not because they need to fool the people, but because the people are going to call them out. Does that make sense? And too often in religion, what happens is that religion gets put solely with the authorities. And I think that religion, when done well, is of the people. I think that we can start to say that, like, it's of the people. The people are important. It's not just us clerics. And there's clerics in mostly every tradition except for Taoism, because they don't normally have a central location to do any of this kind of stuff, because they're out in nature moving towards the mountains. All right, any questions about pre-understanding? Okay. We all have pre-understanding, and we all have to have it adjusted, okay? Now, let me roll over here to my teaching outline and just look at something. All right, so, all right, how do we go about studying or discussing the idea of religion, or even better yet, world religion? Okay, one of the first things that we need to do is we need to ask the question, do we say they are all the same, or do we say they are all different? What do you think? Yeah, like
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
My initial reaction is to think that they may all have some sort of similar significance, but they're all going to be culturally different, which I think is very important.
Yeah. Yeah. Susan, you were going to say something? You were going to say something? Oh, no, the microphone scared it away. All right, no microphone, no microphone.
All right.
Right. Yeah, is someone else trying to talk?
This is God speaking.
God, Ralph.
All right. The question I really have is Christianity embodiment of pre-awareness of the true spirit? And in the sense that it has a doctrine, other religions have a doctrine, but until you move to the real spiritual side of this religion and that religion, you only then start to find the common ground. And it doesn't have to be with it could be with the embodiment of a group of people. It could be with an individual.
Right. Okay. So what I'm hearing you ask is, are you challenging the fact that Christianity can be a little bit calcified in its doctrines and dogmas?
Seriously calcified, in my opinion.
Okay. So one of the neat
And
things,
it's not the only one. I mean, they all have that
yeah,
element.
yeah. The monotheistic traditions tend to have parts of the system that are pretty adamant of one thing, like it must go this way. But simultaneously, these monotheistic traditions can also have mystical components, which is, I think, where you want to go, Roger. Ralph.
Wow. Yeah. The point is that you have the whole spectrum
Yeah.
of the religious to spiritual experience embedded in the religion in quotes that you're dealing with. Sufism, mystics, Buddha. I mean, you run down the line, they all have their premier example of the ultimate spiritualist.
Yeah. That is one. That is one. Though we may have a pre-understanding. I haven't forgotten what you're saying, Ralph. No. When we look at the fact that we have pre-understanding, we have a pre-understanding that they're all very different or they're all very the same. And this is why we had all those discussions about pre-understanding coming into this, because if you believe that every religion, and I like that Ralph asked this question because it does cause my mind to sort of run in like 14 different directions, which might cause me to fall down. But we need to address, how are we going to look at religions? Are they all speaking about the same thing generally, so they're kind of the same? Or are they so different that they're just irreconcilable? And does it have to be a binary?
No. No. My thought, and it could be because I'm highly influenced by existential theology, is that religion, no matter where, it can look very different, and it could, but we're all wrestling with existence in some way. We do that through myth. We do that through wrestling with the divine. I think you look at the Hebrew Bible and see this, what it looks like to wrestle with the concept of divine and our divine reality.
Yeah, like it's really, there are, if you were to draw a Venn diagram of like all the major traditions, you would probably find some similarities and you'd find some distinctions. Okay? One thing is that popular culture really, specifically Western popular culture, really loves the idea that it's all just one. Okay? It's all the same. It's all the same. Okay? But there are some serious problems. For instance, if it's all the same, then how do you reconcile the monistic aspect of Sikhism, where there is no real significant person of a divine quality, with Judaism that has a clear cut, this is God. And then how do you reconcile Judaism with Christianity, who declares that this human being is also God? Okay, so when we don't see that there are differences, then we'll try to push everything under our pre-understanding of what religion is, and all of a sudden, all my Buddhist friends, all my Muslim friends, all my Taoist friends, all my Sikh friends are now worshiping something that looks like God, the parent of Jesus Christ. Okay? Because my pre-understanding is pretty strong. So we want to resist the temptation, okay? Because we want to be able to ask the 7 questions, and that's what Annette brought up a little bit ago. We want to ask the 7 questions. What's going on here? We want to let religions talk to us. But if we're coming into this discussion with a pre-understanding that they're all just really the same, or they're all just human-made, or they're all super, super different, and so conversation is pointless, okay, then we're going to truncate any potential seeking and acquisition of knowledge, right? You're actually going to calcify into that pre-understanding if you're not willing to be confronted, and maybe in an uncomfortable way, okay? When we ignore the differences, so one of the issues with thinking that all religions are just really the same when you get down to it, is that you miss out on the extreme branches, specifically of, well, actually, I've learned recently that there are militant Buddhist monks, and they are packing weapons like underneath their robe. But when we think that all religions are just the same, we will not notice when the militant branches of the traditions come, okay? Because we won't be looking for it, because we'll try to push everything under this big common umbrella that kind of has this generic nice feel, and we won't see the militant, like the militant extremist interpretations of those traditions. Does that make sense? Okay, Christianity has some militant aspects. I always bring up Westboro Baptist Church. Okay, that is a version and an interpretation of Christianity. We have militant Buddhist monks. We have militant Hindus. Okay, and so when we start to say everything is the same, we won't see those factions that are splintering. Okay, and that's important because we don't want to say the words, well, that's just not Christianity, or that's just not, because it's an actual, we need to accept these militant factions as an interpretation of the same message that we believe. So Westboro Baptist, in its proclamation of very legalist, literalist readings of certain texts of the sacred text for Christianity, we have to acknowledge that that's an interpretation so that we move around it rather than into it. Does that make sense? It's okay if it doesn't. Yeah.
Lawrence Rao. I
Can't hear you.
want to take, I don't want to say move around it, as
Okay.
so much to acknowledge it without judgment, because it's where those people happen to be, and it's not my position to judge where they are or are not. As long as I understand they have a view that is in conflict with me or mine, and that I have to be aware of any potential violence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to defend my religious position, but to make sure my personal safety isn't compromised by their vehemence.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And when I meant move around it, I didn't mean it in terms of kind of turning a blind eye to it. What I was going to say was, I think I brought up John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Have I brought up John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress and Apollyon, the Dark Knight? Do you remember what I told you Christians' best defense mechanism against Apollyon, the Dark Knight is? It's to see him and acknowledge him and call him for what he is. Okay? That is always the strength. When we turn a blind eye to the factions, or as in like avoid them, don't acknowledge them, or when we try to fight against them, that's that judgment that you're picking up on, we will lose. We will end up becoming a part of the problem and not part of the solution. So I do like that Ralph brought this up, because we can say, I see violence in that. We don't necessarily need to condemn, which causes us to participate in the exact same thing that we are criticizing. Okay? So we always, it's about seeing things for what they are. Okay? I would say that we want to look for life in so many things. And where we see death being done, then we need to sort of say death is being done with that message. You don't have to judge or condemn the people who are involved in it. That's between them and God. But you can certainly be in that position, see it for what it is, and step into it, and then say something like, well, I'll bring life. Okay? Not that you have to actually step in front of a marauding group of people from Westboro Baptist. I would not recommend it. I had, when the Pulse shooting happened in Orlando, the cathedral there did 3 funerals for 3 of the victims, and Westboro showed up, and it was pretty intense. And the bishop of Central Florida said, I am in a position to make sure that these people have comfort and that they can grieve. So, but you see what I'm saying? Like, when you see something for what it is, you can step in and offer the other thing that's not being offered. All right, so one of the things that we have a problem with when it comes to discussing religion is that we are deep down, well, maybe not all of us. I have a feeling some of us might be okay with conflict, but we don't like conflict. We are trained from, think about like your childhood. My daughter, Liza, she would come, when she first learned this phrase in preschool, she would come home, as powerful as she is, she was about this tall, and she would come home and her brothers wouldn't give her something. You know what she would say? Or correction, holler at them? Sharing is caring. Oh, Liza. Okay, settle down. That's not necessarily what that phrase means. You don't say it like that, right? So we have this tendency, and I do believe that sharing is caring. I'm not downplaying the phrase, but we tend to have a thing where everyone must get along. Everyone must get along. This eventually teaches kids not to actually have healthy conflict in a safe environment, all right? It's not just about making sure everyone is, never has a conflict with one of their peers, but that when they do, they learn healthy skills to navigate it, all right? All of this is leading up to the idea that when we are stuck in pre-understanding, okay, this is going back to the knowledge thing. When people understand what they know or what they believe, and they've done the wrestling with, I believe John Mark mentioned wrestling at the beginning. When people have done that deconstruction of what they've been force-fed, and then they look down, they see the pieces, and they start rebuilding, that structure becomes so much more substantial and sturdy, because this person now can walk into the world and say, I know what I believe and why. Not because some stiletto-wearing priest wearing red lipstick on Sundays forced it down my throat, because that's not a secure place to be. So when you're engaging with someone and you go to challenge and you notice that defensive sort of reaction, what you're doing is you've tapped on something where that foundation isn't firm. And they've been told, this is the way it is, okay? So we need to find spaces, create spaces where healthy conflict within the self and with others can actually grow into a process by which we acquire more information to alter our what?
Worldview.
Yes, pre-understanding.
Yeah.
We've moved on from worldview. Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung.
World picture.
Weltanschauung. Yeah, it's got 2 U's in a row, which Germans just have all the fun with their vowels. We're trying not to say worldview anymore. I don't know why. I think because they just like messing with us. But yeah, our pre-understanding, the way that we see things, when I've seen this in students, when teenagers are given a space, a real space, excuse me, I just spit everywhere. When teenagers are given a real space to kind of run up and practice their adulting against another adult that isn't mom and dad, this is what's so cool about school. When they can do that, you know what happens? They eventually, they thicken in their intellect, and they thicken in their emotions, and they realize that their opinion and their ideas and their thoughts matter and are fun to engage with, and they start throwing questions. And then you start answering, and then they start questioning back, and you answer, and the question and the answer, and then they leave, and they're on a little bit more stable ground. Okay? So I believe, I'm a big fan of making sure that the people that God has put me in front of to shepherd, that shepherding isn't into some sort of very specific, narrow idea, but that you three, and then all of you on the screens, learn what it is that you believe and why. And it's probably going to be reminiscent of each other's to some extent, and then vary in other ways. But when you have that solid presence of self, and you can understand what you believe and why you believe it, then when you go to engage someone who's totally different, your defensive reaction isn't going to get triggered as fast, though there will be some, okay? Though there will be some. All right. Questions?
I have a strange tension commentary.
Yeah.
So Ralph, I think it was talking about how we walk into spaces, or we try not to judge people for their position. I used the Westboro, or not, yeah, I use Westboro Church, or I think about the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. There are a couple of things we have to wrestle with there, right? Because on the one hand, especially when we come through Christianity and being influenced by Judaism, we like to think about things in boxes. Proverbs is a good idea about this, right? We have this, blessed is this, cursed is this, basically. This is right, this is wrong. We have these moral inclinations toward those things. And the language here is funny or interesting to me, because moving around is kind of hard. I mean, I got where Ralph was coming from, where like it's kind of turning a blind eye or something. Mine is to accept, not in a supportive sense, but in a fact that, especially when we think about Christianity and we think about these factions, that they cause a lot of pain in the world, especially for a lot of different marginalized groups. And I cannot take that pain away.
Right.
And so whether or not I am in a different branch of the body of Christ, I have to accept that part of the body of Christ is hurting a great deal of people.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of ignoring that and say they're not Christians, which I feel like I wrestled with for a long time, it's like, instead you have to create this counter narrative. So there's this tension of not wanting to jump somebody, but the fact that we have this want to create a counter narrative, the fact that we want to call them out wrong, we can call it whatever we want. We're still making some sort of judgment in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lauren, Ralph.
Yes. Ralph.
I got 2 points. If we are not listening and we are engaging in some kind of, I hear you, I'm going to talk back to you, that's a judgment play.
Okay.
That's engaging them and can move into negative space very quickly.
Yeah.
That is not acknowledging that person's journey in God. I don't care what religion or what denomination or what worldview, that person's on their own walk, and God has not tapped me on my shoulder and said, this is truth, because I just don't know. If I am present to listening, then I just might learn something. If nothing else, it can test my intermental against what they're saying and strengthen and challenge my own belief system and create a learning opportunity for me, which I hope makes me richer. And maybe them listening to themselves, it'll start to break down their harder thinking in the comments.
I think we lost audio from the church.
Can you hear me?
I can
Can you
hear
hear
you.
us,
Yeah,
Lauren?
I can,
We're back.
but I can't hear the church, I don't think.
Hey, Lauren. Can you hear? Wave if you can hear me. Okay. Press that. Just use that other mic if you don't mind. That'd be easiest.
Feelings. Okay. What I wanted to say was, what I wanted to say to tag off what Ralph said is that a most beautiful. Okay, I have a fantastic relationship with John Mark, and I think that we overlap in a lot of philosophical ideals, but we're actually very different spiritually. Okay, one of my dearest friends is a Byzantine Catholic priest who saw that coming. I am so Protestant, I make John Calvin jealous. Okay, one thing about the Byzantine Catholic priests is they love their icons and they love their incense, and it is done up. You want to see church done? You go to Jeff's church. He and I are so different when it comes to what feeds us spiritually. But we overlap in one thing, and that is God loves people. God loves the world. And so we team up on that point, all right? And then we encourage each other further into what it is that feeds us spiritually. The same thing, when you know what you believe as a Christian and why, then when you engage with someone from a different tradition, you don't have to convert them to get them to be like you so that you can have similarities. You can merely engage in dialogue exactly what Ralph was saying in a way that actually encourages that person to go deeper into their tradition without feeling threatened. But it all starts with you and your pre-understanding, specifically of that immediate circle that surrounds you, and then learning about all the other ones, okay? And now with that, I want to give people a break. Are we good? Okay, take a break. Like David Dancy, just taking a break on his couch. I bet that died. Yeah. Hello? Yeah, I think.
Hey, Brian. The thing that usually happens there is that switch is bad next to her channel, whatever one that headset 3 is on. So if you click and unclick the 1-2 and the 2-3 switches, it might fix it. But I think that generally speaking, that soundboard's just going bad. That's what I fixed it. That's how I fixed it last time. I don't know what happens. Something's dirty in that connection or something.
Hello? Hello, hello, hello. Oh,
Yeah, that's working now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I still think the battery might be telling us something. I'm going to stick with the microphone. Just because.
It's better for singing that way.
Much better lounge appeal.
All right. I'm going to call everyone back. Come back. I'm like staring at the screen. Like if I stare hard enough at all the Zoom screens, everyone will come back. In my last posting, I worked with someone who was a pretty high Anglo-Catholic individual. And I was standing next to what I would call a kid right out of seminary. And I made a joke with the guy that was in front of me, who's the high Anglo-Catholic. And I said, hey, Brant, don't forget the holy digits. And he turned around and was like, you know about the holy digits? And I was like, of course I do. I study all this stuff. Anyway, one of the things, I would love to do a whole bunch of teaching around the table in terms of what all the different movements mean, because they're all different and they all signify something. It's really stunning and it's super fun because it's like code. But I like to break code. So anyway, so the guy next to me, the kid fresh out of seminary, said, what are the holy digits? And I was like, okay, so when a Catholic priest goes to break the communion after it's been sanctified and consecrated, it is now the body of Christ, and they will not remove their fingers because of the fine pieces of dust. And so they'll keep their fingers together, and there's also the washing bowl to catch it. Okay, so, but what's really neat is that as a very Protestant sort of, again, like make John Calvin jealous, sort of like in the bare necessities of worship. One of the things that's fun about learning really well what other people are doing and other denominations understand is that it actually makes dialogue with priests from different denominations really exciting because it's fun to see the differences. Okay, it's super fun to see the differences, and people feel respected when you've taken the time to learn the ins and outs. And so that same story applies to when we sit down and learn about other traditions. Yes, this is a plug for future spiritual university courses. But here's the thing, is that I told you, I have my magic bag here. It's sort of like Mary Poppins book bag. All right, so in order for us to understand other traditions, we actually have to begin engaging with all the spiritual texts of those traditions. I'm laying out here all the different books that I use, all the different texts that I use for my, like the bigger world religions course. Okay. Now, what I want to highlight is that in looking at these texts, this is a lot of pages, correct? Okay. And someone goes on Wikipedia and they Google, or they go to Wikipedia, they're not Googling anymore, they're Wikipediaing, and they pick up Hinduism and they read those few pages. What's the problem?
They don't have the context.
Nothing. You want to really understand a tradition? You sit down and you learn the like skeletal structure, and then you start jumping into what their texts are saying, okay? Because they're all saying something different. Do you want to tell me that God is one when you look at all these different texts, and I don't even have the Bible up there? Now I do, but it's in German. Here's a Jewish study Bible, right? We have all these different versions of all these different scriptures. To fully understand a tradition, to claim that you know it, to a point where you don't have to listen to someone who's of that tradition means that you've done the work. But we tend to approach, because I Googled it, I've got some ideas, and so now I'm authority on Judaism. Really? What branch? What interpretation? Are you talking about like the more mystical component, or are you going more conservative? What about the Reformed? Because the Reformed Jewish people are nothing like the Reformed Christian people, but that word is the same, right? Like, there's so much embedded in so many traditions that unless you're actually going to try to become a master of all these different traditions, then we need to necessarily take a seat and listen so that we can learn, and then we need to learn how to ask questions, which is why last time we looked at those 7 questions, okay? So I was looking in my book bag to see if there was any other books. I love it when someone tells me, well, the word of God said, and I say, oh, which version of the word of God? Specifically in Christianity, the NSV, NRSV, ESV, right? Goes on. There's like, have you ever gone to BibleGateway.com to look up Bible texts? And you click the what version, and it's like, whoomp. There's a ton of different versions, right? And they're all different. And it's all based off of this text. But every interpretation is slightly different. So what did God say? Can we actually claim with such absolutism that God has said this when we are very dependent on translations of this from people that did not live at this time, right? Like, we have to take it all loosely so that we can be taught something new and when something else comes out, okay? Does that make sense?
What's written in that book was written by a scribe who may have heard this word differently than that scribe who is also writing down.
Yes.
And then how many variations?
Yes.
What the original word?
Mute it, please.
Yes. Yeah, we're calling out the idea that there's scribes who are copying the text from one, and now granted, they were pretty good. But, and then also too, when we go to translate, which is why sometimes if you come to church on Sunday, you'll hear me read a really awkward translation of whatever passage I'm working on, because sometimes what I do is I'll take 2 definitions and throw them in there, because I'm like, nah, that's probably about right. Because that way it gives you a better idea. Rather than just selecting one of those words, I'll choose 2, put a slash, and say, it's kind of somewhere in here. But that the translations are dependent on people, on people who have done history to understand colloquialisms. And, like when the Syrophoenician woman comes up to Jesus, and there's that whole comment about like, you don't give food to the dogs. There are some scholars who fully believe, based off of their understanding of colloquialisms at the time and the way that flirting banter happened, that Jesus wasn't criticizing her. He was kind of bantering, because he realized in her was someone who knew something. And so that's why there's this, it's done with a smile. We hear it as, you don't give food to the dogs. And then she's all, but even the dogs get to, it's more like, well, you know what they say, you don't give food to the dogs. And she's like, oh yeah, but the dogs still eat from the table. It's a playful moment. Jesus laughs way more in the Gospels than we're told. There's a lot of times, like with the how long must I stay with you? I think he probably does it with a little bit of a chuckle and then a big, huge sigh. But in general, I think he's laughing a lot more than we think. But one of the things that I really like about what Susan brought up, which was this idea of transcribal error, can happen, okay? So the dreaded verse in, I think it's 1 Corinthians 14, it's like, I'm just gonna guess like 34 to 35, where it was like, women should stay silent in church. Do you know that it didn't start in chapter 14? No, when you look at manuscripts, that verse, those verses moved through the letter to Corinthians. So you can find it where it's earlier in the book, and then you find it where it's in the middle. So anytime someone was writing it out, they were like, that's weird. Why would you put that there? I know. Let's put it over here right before he talks about the resurrection. Okay? But that happened a lot. And then there's also too where something won't make sense, but as they're transcribing, they'll jump in and he said this so that, like, there are points in the text where someone's explaining something else because the scribe at the time just said, that's really weird. So when you look at ancient manuscripts of these letters, they vary.
Lauren,
Things
Ralph,
get, what?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I got.
No, go for it.
I would argue that there is no text in the world that has a God statement in it.
Yeah,
They're
Yep.
all interpretations of what that writer or listener heard from
Yeah.
somebody speaking about a God interaction.
yeah. Yeah, there is, I have a friend, and he does a really great job of describing this. So the idea that, and I think it's in one of the Timothys, I think it's in 1 Timothy where it is mentioned that the Spirit is God breathed. It's ruach, okay, God's breath. That same word is the same word, that word is the same word that is used of the breath that is blown into that clay turned human form that goes by the name of Adam or humanity. The ruach of God blew into. So I have to ask you a question. Are we perfect? If we are God inspired with the ruach, are we perfect? No, we're good, but we're not perfect. We make mistakes, right? We get close, we get far off at some points. All right, so when we're looking at the text, it can be inspired, but not infallible. Okay, and that's the thing that I think that we get lost in, and not necessarily here. I feel like this group is very open to the idea of the Bible not being like hard and fast, a download from God into a vapid vessel of a prophet. Those prophets had personality, I'll tell you what. They weren't empty beings just spouting off the word of God. They were literally inspired, one, by their environments and the violence that was happening and their awareness and knowledge of what God was for. Okay? They weren't operating in vacuums. The theologians of old weren't operating in vacuums. Augustine had biases, so did Luther, right? Even the most beloved Karl Barth had problems, okay? And so we have to realize that no one that wrote these letters wrote in a vacuum as if they were just pure vehicles for this word of God. Right, Ralph?
Yes, absolutely agree with you. I had to unmute myself so I didn't interrupt you.
All right. So when we want to claim that God is one, we're going to have a major problem doing that unless we can definitely guarantee that all of these texts are talking about the exact same thing. There are overlaps. I will confess, I have read just a few of these in total, and not all of them, and they do touch on some very different things. Okay, so we let the traditions speak for themselves. Do you know where the idea that God is one came from? Like kind of started to kind of birth itself? If you don't know, do you want to take a guess?
Constantine's time?
Constantine?
Like not him specifically, but
Yeah.
around that time as a unification.
Much later.
Yeah.
Much later. World War II. That's where it starts to become a thing because Christianity has to do a very big amount of soul searching for the idea that there was this divorce from Israel. That Christianity was the fulfillment of the Israel scriptures, that somehow the Jewish people were inferior to the Christians. Okay, and so it's got the idea that God is one has a great heart. It's well intended, but ultimately we don't want to stop there. We want to keep moving through, because while we don't want something like the slaughtering of millions of people to ever happen again based off of religious preferences, okay, we don't simultaneously have to start arguing that there's just one God and it's this one thing. We can start to see maybe what Christians need to do first and foremost is maybe remove some of that supersessionist language, meaning that we're the fulfillment of all the prophets. We are the true Israel because we follow Christ. Think of the language that you may feel very accustomed to that sounds like all of the First Testament was really leading up to Jesus, and Jesus is the fulfillment of that, and that would make Christians now superior. Okay, so all we need to do is not say that, well, oh God is one, but what we can do is say, okay, we had that really drastically wrong, and maybe there's a better way for us to conceive our relationship to the First Testament, which is why you start to hear a change from Old Testament to First Testament. Do you see how the old new dichotomy creates a hierarchy? Why are you hanging out with the Old Testament? Don't you know the new is better? New is better. New, right? Anyone still hanging on to the iPhone 2? No. You're not holding on to it. So when we rephrase, a simple rephrasing, calling the Hebrew scriptures the Tanakh, okay, calling that the First Testament gives it a little bit more credence and power as the first word. And as Christians, I think it's very, very important that we do that, because we have a long history of participating in anti-Semitic speech without knowing it. All right? So there's ways to go about merging and indeed just collapsing everything into one, because we still operate with pre-understanding. And when we collapse everything into one, then we lose the distinctions and the beauties of all the other traditions. Okay. We want each tradition to always speak for itself. And so that's why those 7 questions become really, really important for us, so that we learn how to ask questions. And then may we please, and I pray this for myself first and foremost, that while I am good at I'm asking questions, sometimes I'm not good at listening to the answers. Right? We have to also learn to listen. All right, so I talked a little bit about the idea of my truth is my truth. That's another way of taking an out on the hard conversation of difference. Difference, did you know that being different isn't bad, or having distinctions between human beings isn't bad? It's just a distinction, it's just a difference. I remember the silence of the room after my daughter, Liza, when she was about 5, commented on the dark skin of one of my colleagues, as if it was bad for her to notice the beautiful color of his skin. But if it's bad to notice distinction and difference, then we just end up collapsing everyone into our pre-understanding again. Okay, so we don't want to be colorblind when we're talking with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. We don't want to talk about being colorblind, because interestingly enough, most people will start to look white. Okay, so we want to always acknowledge the distinction and differences in different human beings so that they can define themselves to us. And this has been most challenging for a lot of us when it comes to the allowing someone to tell you their pronouns. Okay? It's allowing, all of this is really beautiful, because some of us in the dominant group have been forced onto our heels in terms of not being able to claim we know everything. And so learning how to allow someone to tell them, we wouldn't call everyone little Lisa. Do you remember the clip from, right? When Homer named the girl in front of him little Lisa, we don't want to do that, right? So we want to always be listeners. And so it's not just asking a question, but also holding that space to hear the answers so that we can learn more. Because I do promise you, the more you learn, not only about what you believe and why, but about what other people believe and why, that conversation becomes so robust and magnificent. So robust and magnificent. And let people speak from their experiences in the world, because they really are unique. All of us, we're all really, really super unique, even if we have similarities. Any questions?
I have one brief comment on context. I used to take care of a patient when I was in healthcare. He was a bishop in the Kojic church. And me being the person who wants to understand things more and more as I can, I was reading a book called Heaven on Earth. It's a history of Sharia law. And he and I were talking about Islam. And I thought he had a lot of crazy hot takes on Islam. And so I said, I'm going to give you this book that I was reading. And it's a history of Sharia law. And it's a hard topic. And when we think about like in the Hebrew Bible, a lot of the different laws that they had, I would say those are similar. A lot of them are about keeping community together and unity and trying not to stop any infighting. And so he reads this book and he goes, John Mark, I had no idea Islam was so beautiful. Because he had this context. He had this ability to look further than like the Quran, which he probably had never read, I'm assuming. So I gave him my copy of the Quran too. But he was able to engage in a way than just his pre-understanding, because he listened to a Muslim who wrote about the history of the Sharia, and it cracked open his world. And I was like, holy crap, John Mark, what have I been thinking for, my 60 years on this planet? And it was a really beautiful thing. And I think you're right that we can't say that we know a text just by reading it. We have to wrestle with those concepts and times and historical context.
Yeah, that is, oh, it's not letting me paste into here. Hold on a second. I'm trying to paste a quote that I just want to look at from Nasser so that you're not left to your own devices here. Hold on a second. Let me just make sure that is working. Yeah. I can't get it into the chat. You know what I may do? I may share my screen. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, hold on a second. Hold on. Let me cancel that. I'm just gonna pull this up real quick. Come on. Open. Browse. I'm literally walking you through what I'm doing right now. Okay, now hold on, back over here. Share screen. Okay. Okay. Okay, can you guys see that quote on Zoom? I know, I got you guys covered.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You got it? Okay. Here. All right, I'm just handing this out. Okay, so I told you I would touch base on the text because I don't want you reading through it all by yourself. Okay, so what I'm going to do, if you can read along, and let me make sure it's, let's do, is that better? Zoom?
Yeah, it's good on my end.
Okay, good, good. All right, the problem, Nasser writes, so difficult for modern scholars and philosophers of religion to solve can be analyzed as follows. If God is absolute in the metaphysical and theological sense, and if he speaks as the absolute within a religion, which then claims to be the religion, how is it possible to have a multiplicity of religions, which seems to imply a multiplicity of absolutes? Does this not already relativize the absolute? This is the first and fundamental question. Let us turn to a concrete example. Christ said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The Prophet of Islam said, no one sees God unless he has seen me. One could go down the list of statements of this kind mentioned by founders of other religion. What does this imply? If we take the sayings of the New Testament seriously as Christians, or those of the Quran and Hadith seriously as Muslims, or those of the Bhagavad Gita seriously as Hindus, and so forth, how then does one come to terms with the absoluteness implied by such statements in religions other than one's own? That is what we shall do with the very idea of this sense of absoluteness in religion and the concept of the absolute in metaphysics. Okay, that is the core of this engagement with all these other traditions, this collision of the ideas of absolute. Any thoughts about what Nasser is speaking of there?
I find it interesting that, so for me, the problem with this is there's a subject-object divide here. So all these different traditions are claiming the absolute, and they're doing it within their own language, their own context, their own reason, their own understanding. And whenever we talk about something that's ultimate or absolute, we have to understand that we're coming from a point of finite language, finite reasoning, finite understanding. And so whenever we describe the absolute, we are only describing it in concepts that we can possibly understand within our own context at the time, with our pre-understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else have something to add from the text?
Actually, it's Cynthia here. Actually, it seems that all of this could be taken metaphorically, each one of these statements, and that metaphor can point at truth, but it can be a truth that is more transcendent than the particular metaphoric language. I don't know, that may not ring true, but in the moment it makes sense to me.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I was thinking as I was reading that it really depends on, when you look at that statement from Christ, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. It really depends on what the means. Not to sound like, 1993 Bill Clinton, depends on what you mean by is, but is it the one and only? Like, there is a way for you to leave the Redlands, and it's pretty much Broadway, right? I mean, you could go Broadway that way, right? But there is like one access in the Redlands. That's one of the fears, actually, of the way that Redlands is structured. But it also could be, yeah, this is the way, and this is also the way, and this is the way. Taoism is really great with this. Taoism is one of my favorite religions to teach on because it is so fun. But you can't tell anyone where to find the Tao because then the Tao isn't there. There isn't the Tao, like in terms of like, if I find the Tao somewhere, I can't now bring Susan because Susan may not experience the Tao there. So there is this idea that how we interpret that definite article really makes a difference. And so is it metaphorical, like in terms of, what does Jesus mean in a metaphorical way? The thing is, and this is what I think Nasser is getting at, is that there are factions. This is why we want to resist the tendency to talk about God is one, because there are factions of so many different traditions that do take the absolutist stance. Okay?
I have a question in
Yeah.
regards to the quote from John 14:6 here. So John is probably my favorite gospel. I find it very interesting, mostly because of how it opens in John 1 and that word logos and the Greek concept of not only logos, but logos grammaticos. And so when I personally read things like John 14:6 or 3:16, I look at it as this transcendent logos type of energy or divine being, especially with ideas like the light shines in the darkness does not overcome. It's the light of
Yeah.
all mankind. And so to me, there's certain language within, especially within John 1 and how it pertains to different parts of John, which I think are taken often out of context, that have a much more universal sense and say what we would, like when Paul kind of talks about, it's not whether you become a Jew, like be a Gentile, that's fine, just put on the new creation. There's something transcendent there outside of necessarily, I think, the pre-understanding that someone would bring to that as opposed to worldview.
Yeah. What else about the text? And John is our most philosophical, like he is really addressing all those words that you're not picking up on in the English. John Mark talked about the logos, and that is a loaded term. So when some of us who are very steeped in, like John Mark is, Greek philosophy, and you see the logos, you know that John, when John is penning this gospel, is addressing a certain set of people. And you don't pick it up on the English because it just says word.
Word is my least favorite translation that could possibly have existed there.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else about the text?
There's emphasis on relativism, which I think is great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea that how can you have an absolute within all traditions and then have all those absolutes affirmed? Doesn't that deny the idea that there's an absolute? How can you have a multiplicity of religions? It's tricky. All of this is just to point out that there is no easy solution. So we start with what we know, and we get really good at understanding what it is our tradition's all about, so that when we begin to engage with other people of other traditions, we can be aware that we have a pre-understanding, that we're coming at it from a specific perspective, that we can field answers when we're asked questions, and we don't have to be nervous about conflict.
Wow. The problem is the word absolutes. The issue is everybody thinks they've got the absolute.
Yeah.
But my contention is in every instance, each individual's ability to grasp is beyond their reach. And
Yeah.
we're more at the statement of the attempt than we are the capture.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me, John Mark and I were talking recently about the little story about all the people who are blindfolded with their hands on an elephant, and they're saying that, oh, well, this thing that we're touching is like this, but someone's touching the leg, and someone's touching the trunk, and someone's touching a tusk, right? What was my response? John Mark brought it up, and I said, interesting is that there's a narrator's view who knows it's an elephant to begin with. Yeah, there's something beyond our grasp. That's really well put. And I appreciate that because it reminds me of someone that I know, a professor of theology and religion at a university. And when he just someone who's like wrestled with their, their faith, and when it came down to it, they remained Christian. And when asked why, they said, well, it's what I know. So this is my framework. This is the way that my atmosphere smells and tastes like. It has all the, ingredients that remind me of Christianity, so I should understand how to navigate through this so that I can navigate around and with other people. And so I've always really appreciated that outlook, because the reality is most of us, we like to believe that we could choose any of these religions. Most likely you wouldn't choose anything but Christianity, because it's what you know. Now, you may switch denominations within, yeah, absolutely. But most of us, I won't say all, I'm not going to speak in absolutes. I'm going to absolutely not speak in absolutes. Right, exactly. But most likely you will, it's what you know. It's embedded in our atmosphere in this country, Christianity in its various forms, whether or not you agree with all of it. Most of us probably wouldn't necessarily up and become something else. It's not that free. Some of these traditions, I'm looking at Hinduism and even Buddhism to some extent, Islam especially, have cultural, national feels. You know, when I teach on Hinduism, I always open up with, what does it mean to be a Hindu? Well, you could just be born in India, really. And so it's just such a complicated thing, but it's so complicated, it's beautiful, and it's hours of discussion. And speaking of hours, our hour is up because our hour and a half is up. And I know that my faithful here sitting in wooden pews are looking a little tired. Not bad, not bad. They look great. They look like their pre-understanding is challenged and growing. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so we can have all the people. And then I will open it up for any final remarks. I love all your faces. Should I say it now when I'm looking at myself? Thank you for joining me. This is week 3, and I'm having so much fun. I hope you are too. So, but anyway, any last thoughts for the good of the order? Yeah, please do. Please do. And you can always come back next session with questions. I love questions. I think that it is just so cool when you're processing and you come up with questions. It's religion. There's no one way to think about this. That's why it's fun to teach them.
Is there absolutely no one way to think about this?
There's absolutely. That's the thing, like, you know, and someone's like like some teenagers like, well, you know, everything's relative. I'm like, except that statement. Oh, they can be so sassy. Anyway, all right, I have to recollect my library. I will let you guys hang out until you all decide to go away. And shoot me any. Oh yeah, thanks, John Mark. That's nice of you to put that book in the chat there. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.
Everybody have an incredible evening.
Thanks for all your
Bye.
comments.